At 32 years old, Clara Whitmore stood in the middle of Ash Creek with nowhere left to sleep after the bank seized her family's farmhouse to satisfy a debt her late brother had never lived long enough to repay, and with only $7 hidden inside the lining of her weathered coat, she spent 6 of them on an abandoned icehouse standing beside the forgotten mill pond at the edge of town. A purchase so foolish that even strangers laughed as the rusted key was dropped into her hand, never imagining that behind a row of warped wooden shelves something had remained sealed away for nearly 30 years, waiting for one honest soul willing to value an abandoned building instead of mocking it. A hidden truth that would restore not only Clara's future, but also return justice to families who had quietly carried the weight of an old betrayal for an entire generation. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Whitmore. If you're watching from a place that people have forgotten, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, because forgotten places often hide the greatest stories. Clara Whitmore had been raised to believe that usefulness mattered far more than appearance. Her father, Thomas Whitmore, rarely praised beautiful things unless they had earned that beauty through years of faithful service. To him, a weathered workbench polished smooth by decades of careful hands possessed more dignity than the newest furniture displayed in expensive storefront windows. Every scratch carried a memory. Every repaired crack told the story of someone refusing to surrender what still had purpose. Those lessons shaped Clara long before she understood their importance. The Whitmore family lived on a modest farm outside Ash Creek, a small settlement tucked among rolling hills in northern Minnesota, where winters arrived early and lingered longer than anyone wished. The town revolved around timber, farming, and the enormous icehouse that once stood beside Miller's Pond. During the coldest weeks of every winter, dozens of men carved thick blocks of crystal-clear ice from the frozen pond before hauling them into the towering wooden icehouse, where layers of fragrant sawdust preserved them throughout the hottest months. Every household depended upon that ice. Doctors relied upon it. Butchers relied upon it. Travelers stopping at the Stagecoach Inn welcomed it during humid summers. The icehouse was never merely another building. It was part of the town's heartbeat. As a little girl, Clara often accompanied her father during repairs around Ash Creek. Thomas repaired barns, wagons, grain elevators, smokehouses, and fences, with quiet patience that seemed almost endless. He never hurried, because he believed rushed work eventually demanded twice as much labor. Anyone can replace something, he often told Clara, while carefully fitting a new oak peg into an old wagon wheel. The harder skill is knowing what deserves another chance. She carried those words everywhere. While other children preferred games, Clara wandered through abandoned sheds collecting broken hinges, cracked lanterns, bent horseshoes, worn tools, and splintered wooden boxes. Her mother, Evelyn, laughed whenever Clara returned home with another armful of forgotten objects rescued from roadside ditches or abandoned fields. One day, Evelyn teased, "Our daughter will furnish an entire house with things nobody else wanted." Clara would simply smile before beginning another careful repair. Somehow, beneath rust and dirt, she always imagined the object as it had once been, useful and respected, before neglect disguised its value. Thomas noticed that gift long before anyone else. Rather than discouraging her unusual habits, he began teaching her finer skills. She learned how to sharpen woodworking chisels until they sliced effortlessly through maple and oak. She learned to plane rough lumber smooth enough that fingertips could scarcely detect where old damage ended, and fresh repairs began. She learned to identify different woods by scent alone. Pine carried sweetness. Walnut smelled rich and earthy. Cedar filled the workshop with warm fragrance that lingered for days. Most importantly, she learned that restoration required listening before touching. Every building spoke through loose boards, settling beams, cracked mortar, and worn hinges. Those willing to pay attention rarely misunderstood what needed saving. During long winters, the Whitmore workshop glowed warmly against endless snowfields. Neighbors frequently arrived carrying broken furniture they could not afford to replace. Thomas accepted payment whenever families could offer it, but many left with repaired tables, cradles, cupboards, and rocking chairs, despite having little more than homemade bread or jars of preserved vegetables to exchange. Clara watched carefully. Her father measured wealth differently than most people. He counted gratitude more carefully than coins. Ash Creek itself seemed built upon that same quiet understanding. Every autumn, families gathered to prepare for winter. Firewood was shared without keeping strict accounts. Children outgrew boots, only to discover another family waiting with boots their own children had recently outgrown. Meals appeared on lonely doorsteps after illness. Barn raisings brought entire neighborhoods together before sunrise. Life remained difficult, yet hardships seldom belonged to only one household. People carried one another because they understood someday they might need carrying themselves. Among Clara's happiest childhood memories were evenings spent beside Miller's Pond after the final ice harvest each winter. Workers rested upon enormous stacks of freshly cut ice, shimmering beneath the setting sun like fields of blue crystal. The old icehouse stood proudly nearby, its massive timber walls sheltering enough frozen blocks to serve the community until autumn returned. Children chased each other across patches of lingering snow, while older men swapped stories about blizzards survived. The entire town seemed gathered beneath one roof or another, bound together by work that benefited everyone equally. Even then, Clara noticed details other children overlooked. She admired the careful craftsmanship of the enormous building, thick timber beams locked together without waste. Heavy wooden shelves stretched from floor to ceiling to organize tools, ropes, pulleys, and supplies. Massive insulated walls kept summer heat outside. Everything possessed purpose. Nothing existed merely for decoration. Thomas once rested his hand against one of those towering support posts and quietly remarked, "Buildings like this are promises. They tell a town that tomorrow has already been prepared." Clara remembered that sentence for years afterward without fully understanding it. She would someday, long after the laughter of childhood faded, after seasons changed and familiar faces slowly disappeared, those words would return when she needed them most. For now, however, the future still seemed generous. The fields remained fertile. The workshop stayed busy. The ice house continued standing beside the frozen pond, like an unshakable guardian watching faithfully over Ash Creek, while a young girl quietly learned that forgotten things often carried far greater worth than anyone first believed. As Clara entered her teenage years, people throughout Ash Creek slowly began to notice that she possessed a rare kind of patience, one that could not be taught in schools or purchased with money. When neighbors declared an old cupboard beyond repair, Clara quietly carried it home, spending evenings replacing hidden joints until every drawer slid as smoothly as the day it had first been built. When an elderly widow believed her late husband's broken rocking chair belonged on the firewood pile, Clara carefully restored every spindle before returning it without asking for payment. The widow wept quietly as she lowered herself into the familiar chair once again, saying it felt as though her husband had briefly come home. Moments like those taught Clara something no craftsman ever wrote inside a handbook. People rarely brought her broken objects because they cared about the objects themselves. They brought memories they feared losing forever. She learned that restoring something useful often meant restoring hope at the very same time. Her mother noticed this long before Clara did. Evelyn often watched from the kitchen window as another grateful neighbor carried home something everyone else had considered worthless. "Your father repairs wood," she once said while folding fresh bread into a linen cloth. "You repair hearts without realizing it." Clara laughed softly, embarrassed by the compliment, but the words remained with her. She never believed herself extraordinary. She simply refused to throw away anything that still possessed the smallest chance of serving someone again. The seasons continued passing with comforting familiarity. Spring filled the valley with rushing streams fed by melting snow. Summer painted every pasture deep green, while children fished along Miller's Pond until twilight. Autumn arrived wrapped in brilliant gold and crimson leaves drifting across wagon roads. Winter transformed Ash Creek into a quiet world of white fields, frozen fences, and chimneys, releasing ribbons of smoke into pale blue skies. Through every season, the great icehouse remained the tallest structure outside the church steeple. It symbolized preparation, cooperation, and trust. During harvest festivals, older townsfolk often pointed toward it while telling newcomers how their grandparents had built the enormous structure together without outside help. Every beam represented another family lending labor. Every wall held the fingerprints of neighbors who believed communities survived only when everyone contributed something. Clara loved listening to those stories because they reminded her that lasting things were rarely built by one person alone. One crisp October afternoon, Thomas took Clara inside the icehouse after delivering replacement timbers for a repair. The cool air wrapped around them immediately, despite the mild weather outside. Tall wooden shelves stretched almost to the ceiling, neatly holding ropes, iron hooks, wooden mallets, ledgers, and tools used during the annual harvest. Sunlight slipped through narrow windows high above, creating golden beams that danced across drifting sawdust. Thomas paused beside one section of shelving and smiled thoughtfully. "Most people only notice the ice," he said, "but this building survives because of everything they never see." Clara looked around curiously. "What do you mean?" He gently knocked against one of the enormous support posts hidden behind stacked shelves. "Strong buildings hide their greatest strength where no one thinks to look." She reached out, placing her hand against the cool timber. It felt solid, dependable, almost alive beneath her fingertips. "Remember that," Thomas continued. "The strongest people often do the same." Clara nodded, though she could not yet know how deeply those words would shape her future. Years later, standing inside that same forgotten building under very different circumstances, she would remember every syllable exactly as he had spoken them. Life, however, rarely announces when ordinary days are quietly becoming precious memories. By the time Clara celebrated her 21st birthday, subtle changes had already begun reshaping Ash Creek. New mechanical refrigeration systems slowly appeared in larger cities farther south. Railroads expanded, bringing faster deliveries and different ways of preserving food. Merchants spoke excitedly about progress, while older craftsmen exchanged uneasy glances whenever those conversations drifted through the general store. The annual ice harvest grew smaller each winter. Fewer workers arrived at Miller's Pond before dawn. Sections of the towering icehouse stood empty for the first time anyone could remember. Some declared the old building obsolete. Others insisted it would always have purpose. Clara never joined those debates. She simply noticed that every abandoned place seemed to disappear first from people's conversations before it disappeared from the landscape itself. Once a community stopped remembering why something mattered, neglect arrived naturally afterward. Thomas noticed the same change. One evening, while locking the workshop after sunset, he looked toward the distant outline of the icehouse against the fading sky. "Buildings don't die because they grow old," he murmured. "They die because people stop believing they are worth saving." Clara followed his gaze across the quiet valley. The weathered structure stood exactly as it always had, proud despite its growing silence. She felt an unexpected sadness she could not quite explain. Perhaps it was because she understood, even then, that forgotten places often reflected forgotten people. Neither deserved to be abandoned simply because the world had chosen something newer. She silently promised herself that if the day ever came when everyone else turned away from the old icehouse, she would at least remember what it had once meant. She could never have imagined that promise would one day become the foundation upon which her entire life would be rebuilt. Not long after Clara reached her 22nd year, the quiet rhythm that had shaped her entire childhood began changing in ways no one could fully understand. It started with Thomas Whitmore returning home earlier than usual after long days repairing wagons. He insisted nothing was wrong, laughing away Evelyn's concern by blaming stiff joints and colder mornings, yet Clara noticed how often he paused to catch his breath after lifting even modest pieces of lumber. His steady hands remained skilled, but the strength behind them slowly faded. Without complaint, Clara assumed more of the heavier work around the workshop. She sharpened tools before sunrise, hauled timber from neighboring farms, and completed repairs that once belonged to her father alone. Thomas never thanked her directly because he knew she required no praise. Instead, he quietly left the finest chisels within her reach each morning, a silent acknowledgement that she had become his equal long before either of them admitted it aloud. Their workshop continued serving Ash Creek faithfully, but changes beyond the valley slowly reached even their isolated community. New businesses opened in larger towns. Wealthy investors arrived speaking confidently about modernization, efficiency, and progress. They praised machinery while dismissing older trades as relics destined to disappear. The enormous icehouse beside Miller's Pond attracted particular attention. Several businessmen argued that maintaining such a large structure no longer made financial sense. Mechanical refrigeration, they claimed, represented the future. Why preserve an aging wooden building when newer technology promised greater profits? Many townspeople resisted those ideas at first, believing traditions carried value beyond simple economics. Yet year after year, the ice harvest grew smaller. Fewer wagons arrived. Empty shelves multiplied inside the great building. Slowly, almost unnoticed, confidence gave way to uncertainty. Thomas often stood at the workshop window, watching workers pass toward the shrinking harvest each winter. "The dangerous thing about progress," he once said quietly, "is that it sometimes forgets who paid for the road leading there." Clara understood exactly what he meant. The old ice house had never belonged to one family. Nearly every household in Ash Creek had helped build it decades earlier. It represented cooperation rather than ownership. Watching it slowly fall into disuse felt strangely similar to watching the town forget part of itself. Then came the spring that changed everything. Thomas collapsed while repairing a neighbor's grain wagon beneath the warm afternoon sun. By the time Clara reached him, he could no longer stand without assistance. The town doctor did what little medicine of the time allowed, advising complete rest and lighter work. Thomas smiled politely, fully aware that craftsmen living on modest earnings seldom enjoyed such luxuries. Bills accumulated faster than completed repairs. Clara worked from dawn until well after sunset, accepting every job available regardless of size. She repaired barn doors, sharpened plow blades, restored church pews, rebuilt broken cabinets, and mended children's cradles, worn smooth by generations of use. Every coin disappeared almost immediately toward medicine, food, and overdue accounts. Evelyn quietly began selling treasured family possessions one piece at a time, without telling either Thomas or Clara. The silver serving tray from her wedding vanished first, then her mother's china. Finally, the old grandfather clock that had stood faithfully inside their hallway since before Clara was born disappeared from the house. Each missing object left behind more empty space than anyone wished to acknowledge. Thomas noticed anyway. One evening he gently reached for Evelyn's hand. "You're selling memories now." She smiled through tired eyes. "No, I'm buying more time with you." He squeezed her fingers, but said nothing more. Some conversations required silence instead of answers. Thomas survived another year, though he never again regained his former strength. He spent long afternoons teaching Clara finer points of craftsmanship that books could never explain, how to recognize hidden wrought simply by tapping a timber, how to balance the weight of a cabinet door so it closed naturally, how to repair old joints without erasing the marks left by previous generations. "Leave honest history wherever you can," he often reminded her. "Perfection isn't the goal, faithfulness is." Those became the last lessons he ever gave. On a quiet autumn morning, while sunlight filtered gently through the workshop windows, Thomas Whitmore passed away in the very chair where he had spent countless evenings sharpening tools beside his daughter. Ash Creek mourned deeply. Farmers left fields untended long enough to attend his funeral. Children he had once helped now stood as grown adults beneath the church roof. Even travelers passing through town paused respectfully after hearing his name. Clara accepted every condolence with quiet dignity, but grief settled inside her like winter frost, silent and unyielding. Evelyn tried bravely to continue, though loneliness slowly stole the brightness from her once cheerful spirit. She still baked bread for neighbors. She still watered the small flower garden Thomas had planted beside the porch, yet each evening she lingered beside the empty workshop door before returning inside, as though expecting to hear familiar footsteps that would never again cross the threshold. Less than 18 months later, illness claimed Evelyn as gently as evening shadows stretching across the valley. She passed peacefully with Clara holding her hand. Before closing her eyes one final time, she whispered the same words she had spoken countless evenings while lighting their front window lamp. "Keep hope where someone can find it," Clara promised she would. She intended to keep that promise for the rest of her life. Alone for the first time, she threw herself entirely into work. The workshop remained busy enough to survive, though never comfortably. Then another blow arrived without warning. Her older brother Benjamin, who had left Ash Creek years earlier hoping to build a successful grain business farther west, returned carrying far heavier burdens than luggage. Drought, failed investments, and dishonest partners had buried him beneath impossible debts. Clara welcomed him home without hesitation. Family, she believed, belonged together most when life became difficult. Benjamin carried shame more heavily than his traveling bags. He worked tirelessly beside Clara for several months, trying desperately to repay what he owed. Unknown to her, however, he secretly borrowed money from the Ash Creek Mercantile Bank, using the family farm as collateral. He believed one final business opportunity would restore everything before anyone discovered the loan. Instead, disaster struck once more. A warehouse fire destroyed nearly every shipment connected to his investment. Benjamin never recovered from the crushing weight of failure. During one bitter winter journey, attempting to negotiate extensions with distant creditors, he became gravely ill and died before reaching home. Clara learned of the loan only weeks after burying her brother. The bank manager, Edwin Mercer, arrived carrying official documents and expressions carefully practiced to appear sympathetic. According to the signed agreements, the outstanding debt now far exceeded anything the modest farm could repay. Clara explained she had known nothing about the mortgage. Edwin listened politely but remained unmoved. "The signatures are lawful," he said quietly. "The bank has obligations of its own." She offered years of labor instead of immediate payment. He declined. She proposed selling portions of the land gradually while retaining the workshop. Again, he refused. Policies, regulations, and legal procedures mattered more than circumstances. Within a month, foreclosure notices appeared upon the front gate. Neighbors organized collections hoping to raise enough money to help, but the debt had grown beyond anything ordinary families could overcome. Clara watched strangers measure fields her father had cleared by hand. She watched inventory lists prepared for public auction. She watched generations of careful work reduced to columns of numbers inside thick account books. The day the bank claimed the farm dawned beneath a gray sky, heavy with approaching snow. Clara packed only what she could carry herself: her father's tools, her mother's Bible, a small wooden box containing family photographs, one wool blanket, 2 changes of clothing. Before leaving, she walked slowly through every room, resting her hand against worn doorframes polished smooth by decades of family life. She did not weep. Some grief settled too deeply for tears. As she stepped onto the porch, she looked one final time toward distant Miller's Pond. Beyond the frozen water stood the abandoned Icehouse, weathered but still standing after years of neglect. Most people saw only another forgotten building awaiting collapse. Clara remembered something different. She remembered her father's voice echoing softly inside its towering walls. The strongest buildings hide their greatest strength where no one thinks to look. With only $7 stitched into the lining of her weathered coat, and nowhere left to call home, she quietly walked toward the one place everyone else had already decided was beyond saving. Clara reached the edge of Ash Creek shortly after sunrise, her boots leaving quiet impressions in the damp earth as a thin veil of autumn mist drifted across Miller's Pond. The abandoned icehouse stood beyond the silent shoreline, exactly as she remembered from childhood, though the years had altered it more than memory ever admitted. Its once proud cedar walls had faded to weathered silver beneath decades of harsh winters. The roof sagged slightly beneath the weight of neglected seasons. Wild grasses reached almost to the lower windows, while climbing vines wrapped themselves around the great timber beams, as though nature had slowly begun claiming ownership of what people had forgotten. Yet despite every sign of neglect, the building still stood with quiet dignity. It had not collapsed, it had endured. Clara stopped several yards away, resting her father's worn tool chest upon the ground. For several long moments, she simply looked at the enormous structure without speaking. It reminded her strangely of herself. Time had stripped away much of what once gave it purpose, yet beneath the weathered exterior, the foundation still refused to surrender. She smiled faintly. "Perhaps we're both looking for another chance," she whispered. The town office occupied a modest brick building overlooking the main square. Inside, several farmers waited to settle tax records, while merchants discussed grain prices before the morning bustle began. Conversation faded almost immediately when Clara entered carrying her small trunk. News traveled quickly in Ash Creek. Everyone already knew the Whitmore farm had been claimed by the bank the previous afternoon. Behind the counter sat Walter Grayson, the elderly town recorder whose spectacles always seemed one size too large for his face. He greeted Clara with genuine kindness. "Miss Whitmore," he said softly, "what can I do for you?" Clara reached into the hidden lining of her coat and carefully placed $6 upon the polished counter. Their quiet, metallic sound seemed louder than it truly was. Every eye inside the office turned toward the little stack of coins. "I'd like to purchase the abandoned icehouse beside Miller's Pond." For several seconds no one spoke. Then an older merchant chuckled beneath his breath. Another man looked toward his neighbor, as though waiting for someone else to explain the joke. Walter removed his spectacles and slowly cleaned them with a folded handkerchief before looking back at Clara. "You understand the building has been abandoned for nearly 15 years? I do. The roof leaks. It can be repaired. The insulation has mostly rotted away. Wood can be replaced. Nobody has found a practical use for it in years." Clara folded her hands calmly before answering. "That doesn't mean it has no value." Quiet laughter spread through the room. "Poor girl's grieving," someone whispered. "She's buying memories." Another shook his head. "Should have saved the money for food." Walter ignored the comments. Instead, he reached beneath the counter and removed an enormous leather ledger containing property records stretching back decades. Turning several yellowed pages, he finally stopped beside one faded entry. "Technically," he admitted, "the town council voted years ago that anyone willing to accept responsibility for maintenance could purchase the old icehouse for $6. Frankly, we never believed anyone would ask." Clara gently pushed the coins toward him. "Then I'd like to ask." Walter studied her expression carefully. He found no hesitation there, only quiet certainty. Dipping his pen into black ink, he began preparing the transfer papers while speaking almost apologetically. "There will be no funding from the town for repairs." "I understand. The surrounding land remains public property. That's fair. Any restoration costs belong entirely to you. I expect nothing else." Walter smiled faintly. "Your father always said stubbornness could become a virtue if guided by kindness." Clara smiled for the first time that morning. He usually turned out to be right. A few moments later, Walter slid the completed deed across the counter, together with an enormous iron key darkened by rust and age. "Well," he said warmly, "I suppose Ash Creek has an icehouse keeper again." The words lingered in the room. Several people exchanged puzzled glances. No one laughed anymore. Clara thanked Walter quietly, gathered her belongings, and stepped back into the crisp autumn sunlight. As she walked toward Miller's Pond, curious eyes followed her from storefront windows and porch steps. By noon, nearly every resident of Ash Creek had heard the story. The woman who had lost her family's farm had spent nearly every coin she possessed buying the oldest abandoned building in town. "She's finally broken," one shopkeeper remarked while arranging apples outside his store. "Grief makes people foolish. That old place should have been torn down years ago. She'll last a week before asking the church for help." Clara heard fragments of those conversations carried gently by the breeze, but she never slowed her pace. The heavy wooden doors of the icehouse remained secured by an enormous iron lock coated with years of rust. She inserted the ancient key slowly, applying steady pressure until the mechanism finally surrendered with a deep metallic click that echoed through the silent building. Taking hold of the weathered handle with both hands, she pulled. At first, nothing happened. The swollen wood resisted stubbornly after years of rain and winter frost. Clara leaned her shoulder firmly against one door. With a long, groaning creak that seemed almost like a sigh of relief, the massive entrance finally opened. Cool air flowed outward, carrying the unmistakable scent of aged timber, damp earth, cedar sawdust, and forgotten years. Tiny particles of dust drifted lazily through broad shafts of sunlight pouring between narrow wall slats. The silence inside felt unlike ordinary emptiness. It felt patient, respectful, as though the building itself had waited quietly for someone willing to return. Clara stepped across the threshold. Her footsteps echoed softly against the towering wooden walls. The interior appeared even larger than childhood memory had preserved. Heavy support beams stretched high overhead beneath a remarkable framework of hand-hewn timbers that remained astonishingly solid despite decades of neglect. Long wooden shelves lined one entire wall, still standing exactly where workers had once stored ropes, tools, hooks, and records during the annual harvest. Most shelves now held nothing except dust, abandoned crates, and scattered fragments of old sawdust hardened by time. Sunlight filtered through narrow windows high above, creating golden columns that illuminated tiny floating particles dancing gently through the still air. Clara slowly removed her gloves and rested one hand against a nearby support beam. The old cedar felt cool beneath her fingertips. "You aren't finished yet," she whispered softly. "Neither am I." She spent the remainder of the afternoon exploring every corner without rushing. Years beside her father had taught her that every old building revealed its condition gradually. She examined roof joints before judging the walls. She inspected foundations before worrying about windows. Broken roof shingles required replacement, but the principal support beams remained remarkably sound. The thick insulated walls, though weathered, still possessed surprising strength. Much of the original shelving had survived untouched. Someone had built this place expecting it to outlive generations. They had succeeded. As evening approached, Clara gathered fallen branches from the nearby woods and lit a small fire inside the old cast-iron stove after carefully clearing the chimney. Warmth slowly returned to the enormous room. Sitting quietly upon an overturned wooden crate, she watched flickering firelight dance across the rows of abandoned shelves. For the first time since losing her home, she no longer felt completely alone. The building seemed strangely welcoming, as though grateful simply to hear another human presence again. The following morning, Clara began cleaning. Hour after hour, she swept away decades of accumulated dust and dried sawdust. She opened stiff windows to admit fresh autumn air. She repaired loose hinges, stacked salvageable lumber, sorted forgotten tools into neat piles, and carried broken debris outside. Every small improvement revealed another reminder of the craftsmanship hidden beneath years of neglect. By late afternoon, the great room already appeared brighter. Sunlight reached corners it had not touched in years. While sweeping behind the tallest section of wooden shelving near the northern wall, Clara noticed something unusual. Unlike the other shelves, which rested flush against the heavy timber wall, this section stood slightly farther forward. Barely an inch, perhaps. Just enough for a narrow shadow to remain visible where none should have existed. Curious, she knelt and brushed away layers of old sawdust collecting near the base. Her fingers found faint scratches surrounding several iron bolts, securing the shelving to the floor. The marks appeared newer than everything around them. Someone, long ago, had carefully removed this enormous shelving unit and then placed it back exactly where it had been. Clara stood slowly, studying the towering shelves in thoughtful silence. She remembered something her father had once said while standing inside this very building years earlier. Strong buildings hide their greatest strength where no one thinks to look. Taking hold of one side of the weathered shelving, she pushed gently. It refused to move. Whatever lay behind it remained hidden with deliberate care. She smiled quietly, fetched her father's old wrench from the tool chest, and knelt beside the first rusted bolt, sensing that someone from another lifetime had left behind one final reason for the abandoned icehouse to be remembered. Clara worked slowly, resisting the temptation to force the old bolts free. Years spent beside her father had taught her that impatience often destroyed the very thing a person hoped to preserve. She brushed away another layer of hardened sawdust before carefully applying a few drops of lamp oil around each rusted iron fitting. Then she waited. Outside, the afternoon breeze carried dry leaves across the frozen edge of Miller's Pond, while inside the abandoned icehouse, only the faint crackle of the stove disturbed the silence. It felt less like an empty building than a sleeping memory, stretching awake after years of neglect. An hour later, the first bolt finally surrendered with a deep metallic groan that echoed through the enormous room. Clara smiled quietly. "Thank you," she whispered, as though the building itself had chosen to cooperate. One by one, the remaining bolts loosened until the towering shelving unit stood free. Even then, she could not move it alone. The shelves had been built from thick oak timbers, their weight multiplied by decades of absorbed moisture. Using two stout pry bars from her father's tool chest, she slowly eased one side forward. The entire structure shifted only a few inches before stopping again. Dust poured downward in pale gray clouds, filling the air with the familiar scent of old cedar and sawdust. Clara stepped back, coughing softly, allowing the dust to settle before continuing. When visibility returned, she noticed something remarkable. Behind the shelving lay a narrow wooden doorway built directly into the insulated wall, so carefully concealed that no casual visitor could ever have noticed it. The small door blended perfectly with the surrounding timber, its grain matching the adjacent boards almost exactly. Only the absence of dust around its edges revealed that someone had once opened it. There was no handle, no visible latch, only a tiny brass keyhole hidden near the lower corner. Clara knelt for a closer look. The brass remained surprisingly untarnished compared with the surrounding hardware, suggesting whoever sealed the compartment had done so with extraordinary care. She searched through the abandoned shelves for nearly half an hour before discovering a small iron key tucked inside a cracked wooden tool tray covered beneath old coils of rope. The key fit the lock perfectly. Her heartbeat quickened. She paused only long enough to steady her breathing before gently turning it. A soft click answered from within the wall. The narrow door opened inward no more than a foot, revealing a hidden storage space scarcely large enough for one person to stand inside. Unlike the neglected icehouse surrounding it, the secret compartment remained astonishingly clean. Thick cedar planks lined every wall. The air smelled dry rather than damp. Someone had built the chamber specifically to preserve whatever rested there. Upon a simple wooden table stood a rectangular walnut box wrapped carefully in faded canvas. Beside it rested a brass oil lantern, several unused candles, and a single folded wool blanket, all arranged with deliberate neatness as though their owner expected to return within days instead of decades. Clara stepped inside almost reverently. The walnut box drew her attention immediately. Its polished surface still reflected faint traces of the afternoon light entering through the open doorway. A small brass plate adorned the lid. She gently wiped away the thin layer of dust. Delicately engraved across the metal were 7 simple words. "To the last honest keeper of this house." Clara stood motionless. She had purchased an abandoned icehouse only the previous morning. Yet whoever placed this box here had written those words many years earlier, somehow believing that someday another keeper would arrive, not chosen by wealth, family name, or position, but by honesty alone. She carefully lifted the box onto the table. It felt heavier than its size suggested. The brass latch opened smoothly despite the passing years. Inside rested several carefully preserved items: a leather-bound journal, a bundle of legal documents tied with blue ribbon, an old survey map of Ash Creek, a silver pocket watch, and a sealed envelope bearing dark red wax. The journal lay uppermost. Clara opened it gently. The first page carried elegant handwriting remarkably preserved by the dry cedar chamber. March 14, 1873. My name is Elias Rowan. If these pages have found another pair of honest hands, then perhaps Ash Creek still has a future after all. Clara slowly lowered herself onto the small wooden stool beside the table. The fading afternoon disappeared around her as she began reading. Elias Rowan had served as both manager and caretaker of the great Icehouse during its busiest years. His journal described the annual harvests in loving detail. Entire families gathered before dawn each winter, singing while teams of horses hauled shimmering blocks of ice toward the enormous wooden building. Children carried warm meals to workers standing ankle-deep upon the frozen pond. Every successful harvest meant another year of security for the town. Clara smiled as she read. Many names filling the journal belonged to grandparents she had heard older residents mention throughout her childhood. The pages breathed with gratitude rather than nostalgia. Elias seemed determined to record not only events but kindnesses. He carefully listed widows who received free deliveries during difficult winters. He praised boys who worked beyond their years to support younger siblings. He described neighbors quietly repairing each other's wagons after storms without expecting payment. Ash Creek had once been more than prosperous. It had been generous. Several chapters later, the tone changed. Elias began writing about outsiders arriving from the railway company together with wealthy investors hoping to purchase land surrounding Miller's Pond. They believed the growing railroad network would soon transform Ash Creek into an important shipping center. Large warehouses, grain depots, and factories promised fortunes for those willing to acquire property before prices increased. Most residents welcomed the opportunity. Elias remained cautious. A town grows strongest when everyone benefits, one entry read. It weakens the moment prosperity belongs only to a handful. Clara continued reading. The journal described secret meetings held late at night inside the offices of influential businessmen. Land records disappeared from public files. Survey markers quietly shifted. Families unable to read complicated legal contracts unknowingly surrendered valuable property for almost nothing. Elias documented every incident carefully, recording dates, witnesses, and names. He had become convinced someone intended to reshape Ash Creek through deception rather than honest labor. Then Clara reached an entry that caused her to stop reading altogether. Today I completed my final will. I have hidden both it and every document proving what was stolen from this town. If honest justice fails during my lifetime, perhaps another generation will finish what I could not. I have concealed everything where greed will never think to search, inside the very building they dismissed as obsolete. Honest people preserve, dishonest people overlook. Clara slowly looked toward the neatly folded bundle tied with blue ribbon. The legal papers resting beside the journal suddenly carried far greater importance than she had imagined. With careful hands, she untied the faded ribbon. Inside rested dozens of original property deeds, signed survey maps, correspondence between Elias Rowan and county officials, and at the very bottom, one thick envelope bearing the official seal of the state probate court. Across its front, written in the same graceful handwriting, appeared another message. The last will and testament of Elias Rowan, to be opened only if Ash Creek has forgotten why this icehouse was built. Clara stared at the sealed document for several long moments while silence settled gently around the hidden room. Outside, evening shadows stretched across Miller's Pond exactly as they had for generations. Somewhere beyond the weathered walls, the people of Ash Creek still believed the abandoned icehouse held nothing except dust and old memories. None of them knew that behind an overlooked shelf rested one final will capable of uncovering a forgotten injustice, returning stolen truths to the families who had lost them, and reminding an entire town that the greatest inheritances were not measured in money, but in the courage of those willing to protect what others chose to abandon. The following morning, Clara rose before the first hint of sunrise, though she had scarcely slept. The hidden chamber behind the shelves remained exactly as she had left it, its narrow cedar walls quietly guarding secrets that had survived nearly 3 decades. Before touching another document, she carefully wrapped the walnut box once more and returned every paper to its proper place. Her father had always insisted that trust began with stewardship. If another soul had sacrificed everything to preserve the truth, then the least she could do was honor that sacrifice with patience rather than excitement. She locked the concealed compartment, slid the towering shelves back into their original position as best she could, and fastened only 2 of the bolts. From the outside, no visitor would suspect anything unusual. Only then did she begin the ordinary work of sweeping floors, replacing broken boards, and repairing loose roof shingles. Anyone watching from outside would see nothing more than a determined woman restoring an abandoned building. That was precisely how Clara intended it. By midday, Captain Owen Carlyle slowly approached the Icehouse carrying a wicker basket beneath one arm. His silver beard shimmered beneath the cool autumn sun as he climbed the gentle slope beside Miller's Pond, stopping now and then to admire the remarkable changes already visible around the old building. "I wondered whether the new keeper remembered to eat," he called warmly before reaching the doorway. Clara welcomed him inside, and the old sailor stopped in quiet amazement. Only 3 days earlier, the enormous room had resembled little more than a forgotten warehouse. Now sunlight reached clean cedar walls, neatly stacked lumber rested beside carefully organized tools, broken windows had been boarded against the wind, and fresh air drifted through newly opened vents. "You've brought life back into this place," he said softly. Clara smiled. It was never truly dead. It only needed someone to believe it still had purpose. Captain Carlyle set the basket upon an old workbench. Inside rested fresh bread, smoked trout, apples, a wedge of sharp cheddar, and a jar of blackberry preserves. "The ladies from church insisted I bring these," he explained. "They said no one rebuilding an entire ice house should go hungry." Clara thanked him with quiet sincerity. They shared lunch sitting beside the open doorway overlooking Miller's Pond, while ducks glided peacefully across still water and bright autumn leaves floated gently toward the shoreline. After several comfortable moments of silence, Captain Carlyle nodded toward the towering shelving along the northern wall. "Old Elias Rowan used to spend hours over there after everyone else had gone home," he remarked thoughtfully. Clara followed his gaze carefully. Did anyone know what he was doing? The old sailor slowly shook his head. Most believed he was organizing records. Elias never explained himself unless he absolutely had to. He chuckled softly. "He once told me the safest place for honesty was somewhere greed would never bother looking." Clara's heart quickened, though she kept her expression calm. "He sounds like a remarkable man." He was. Captain Carlyle looked across the pond toward the surrounding hills. He believed the Icehouse belonged to every family in Ash Creek, said no single person should ever own something the whole town had built together. Those words lingered long after the captain departed. Clara immediately returned to the hidden chamber behind the shelves. She carefully removed the sealed envelope bearing the probate seal and examined it once more. The brittle red wax remained unbroken despite nearly 30 years of silence. Across the front appeared the same careful handwriting she had already come to recognize, the last will and testament of Elias Rowan, to be opened only if Ash Creek has forgotten why this ice house was built. Clara looked around the quiet chamber. No ice had been harvested here in 15 years. Children no longer gathered beside towering crystal blocks each winter. Most younger residents barely remembered what the building had once meant to the community. Ash Creek had already forgotten. With slow, steady hands, she broke the aged wax. The seal separated almost effortlessly. Inside rested several neatly folded pages together with official legal certifications signed decades earlier. The opening paragraphs distributed Elias's modest personal possessions among distant relatives and longtime workers. Nothing seemed unusual until she reached the final pages. There the language changed completely. I leave ownership of the Ash Creek Community Icehouse, Miller's Pond, and every acre surrounding it, not to any single heir, corporation, investor, or public office, but forever to the people of Ash Creek, under the care of a community trust elected by its citizens, that no person may profit from what generations built together. Clara slowly lowered the document. According to every official record currently recognized by the town, the Icehouse had eventually become abandoned municipal property before quietly falling into neglect. Yet this original will declared something entirely different. She continued reading. Should this will fail to reach lawful probate, enclosed evidence will demonstrate deliberate interference by those seeking private ownership of community land. If these pages survive me, let whoever discovers them understand that justice delayed need not become justice abandoned. Behind the will rested another carefully tied bundle, labeled simply "Supporting Evidence." Clara untied the faded blue ribbon. Inside lay original survey maps, property deeds, notarized witness statements, financial ledgers documenting contributions made by dozens of Ash Creek families toward constructing the Icehouse, and several letters exchanged between Elias Rowan and Judge Benjamin Holloway in the county seat. One letter immediately caught her attention. "Your Honor, I fear certain gentlemen intend to prevent my will from reaching your office. Should I fail unexpectedly, I have hidden every original document where dishonest men will never search. Greed never bothers looking behind ordinary shelves because it believes value always announces itself openly." Clara reread the sentence several times. Suddenly, every strange detail surrounding the abandoned building made perfect sense. The concealed chamber had not been built merely to hide valuables. It had been built to protect the legal identity of an entire community. She carefully compared every document spread across the old cedar table. The signatures matched. The dates aligned perfectly. Survey markers corresponded exactly with the maps. Even the receipts documenting construction costs bore names still remembered throughout Ash Creek. The evidence appeared overwhelming. The Icehouse had never belonged to wealthy investors, the bank, or the town council. It had always belonged collectively to the people themselves. As evening settled gently across Miller's Pond, Clara locked every document safely inside the walnut box once more. She understood that simply possessing the truth would not be enough. Powerful lies rarely surrendered quietly. She would need trustworthy allies before revealing anything. The following morning, she visited the small historical archive occupying the upper floor of Ash Creek's public library. Its elderly curator, Margaret Ellsworth, greeted her warmly. "I've heard you've become the keeper of our old Icehouse," she smiled. Clara returned the smile. "I'm trying to become worthy of it." Margaret unlocked a tall oak cabinet and withdrew several faded record books. "There aren't many people interested in Elias Rowan anymore," she observed. "What can you tell me about him?" Clara asked. Margaret carefully turned yellowed pages. "He organized winter relief for struggling families, helped establish the first school, raised funds for the church bell. People trusted him because he always placed the town before himself." She paused before opening another file. There were rumors after his death. Clara looked up. "What kind of rumors?" "That important legal papers disappeared before reaching the probate court." "Was anyone investigated?" Margaret sighed quietly. "Briefly, but influential men preferred that the matter be forgotten." Clara thanked her and returned toward Main Street. As she stepped outside, she noticed Edwin Mercer, the very bank manager who had foreclosed on the Whitmore farm, standing across the street pretending to inspect wagon wheels outside the blacksmith shop. Their eyes met only briefly. Mercer offered a polite smile that carried no warmth before tipping his hat and walking away. An uneasy feeling settled inside Clara. He had no reason to watch her, unless someone had already begun searching for exactly what she had found. That evening, after darkness settled across Miller's Pond, Clara climbed into the loft above the main storage room to inspect several loose roof beams. Through the small upper window, she noticed movement below. A faint lantern glowed near the northern wall, exactly where the concealed compartment remained hidden behind the towering shelves. A lone figure stood motionless, running one gloved hand slowly across the weathered timber as though searching for something remembered long ago. After several moments, the stranger extinguished the lantern and disappeared silently into the darkness surrounding the pond. Clara remained frozen beside the loft window. Only 3 people knew enough to search that exact section of wall. One had died nearly 30 years earlier. Another now stood hidden inside the loft. Which meant someone else, someone still living, had been searching for Elias Rowan's final will long before Clara had ever purchased the abandoned Icehouse. Edwin Mercer did not visit the Icehouse the following morning, nor the morning after that, yet Clara could not shake the feeling that unseen eyes had begun following her quiet routine. She deliberately continued her ordinary work. At sunrise, she repaired cracked siding along the eastern wall. Before noon, she replaced warped roof shingles one careful board at a time. During the afternoon, she sorted rusted hooks, pulleys, and iron tools left scattered across the enormous storage room. Anyone passing the old building would see nothing more than a determined woman restoring an abandoned landmark exactly as she had promised. That appearance suited her perfectly. The greatest protection the hidden chamber possessed was that no one suspected she already knew it existed. By the 4th evening, the Icehouse looked remarkably different. Fresh cedar planks replaced rotten sections near the entrance. Broken windows had been covered with clean timber shutters. The floor, once buried beneath years of hardened sawdust, now revealed broad pine boards still remarkably solid beneath their weathered surface. Standing in the center of the great room, Clara could almost imagine hearing the distant sounds of workers laughing while teams of horses dragged enormous blocks of winter ice through the wide entrance. The building no longer felt abandoned. It felt patient, as though quietly remembering the purpose it had never truly forgotten. Late that afternoon, Walter Grayson climbed the gentle hill from town, carrying several folded newspapers beneath his arm. The elderly recorder paused inside the doorway, removing his hat as he admired the progress surrounding him. "Every time I come here," he said warmly, "the building seems 10 years younger." Clara smiled while brushing sawdust from her sleeves. Perhaps it simply needed someone to sweep away the years. Walter chuckled softly before his expression became more thoughtful. "I should probably tell you something." Clara rested her broom against the wall. "What is it?" Walter glanced toward the open doorway to ensure no one else stood nearby. "Edwin Mercer has been asking unusual questions." Clara remained calm. "About the Icehouse?" Walter nodded. "He wanted to know whether you'd found old records, ledgers, deeds, anything left behind by Elias Rowan." Clara felt her heartbeat quicken, but revealed nothing. "What did you tell him?" "The truth." Walter shrugged gently. "That I hadn't the faintest idea." He lowered his voice even further. Mercer seemed disappointed. After Walter departed, Clara stood alone beside the enormous shelves for several long minutes. The questions were no longer whether someone had hidden Elias Rowan's will. The questions had become who else knew it existed and how far they might go to recover it before the truth reached the proper authorities. That evening she carried the walnut box from the hidden chamber into the small loft above the Icehouse, wrapping it carefully inside 2 wool blankets before placing it beneath loose floorboards where only she would know to search. If someone discovered the concealed room, they would find it empty. The evidence would survive elsewhere. Just after sunset, another visitor appeared. Margaret Ellsworth approached, carrying an old leather satchel overflowing with maps and county records. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she called gently. Clara welcomed her inside. Margaret spread several faded survey maps across the repaired work table. "After you visited the archive yesterday," she explained, "I couldn't stop thinking about Elias Rowan." Her finger rested upon one yellowed map dated almost 30 years earlier. "Look here!" Clara leaned closer. The map clearly showed Miller's Pond, the Icehouse, surrounding farmland, and several parcels labeled Community Trust Property. Margaret unfolded a second map, printed nearly 20 years later. The labels had disappeared. Property boundaries had changed. Several public parcels now belonged to private owners. Clara compared both maps carefully. Someone redrew the boundaries. Exactly, Margaret whispered, but I cannot find any lawful record explaining why. They examined document after document, beneath the warm glow of an oil lamp. Every older survey agreed with Elias Rowan's will. Every newer survey reflected the altered ownership. Somewhere between those years, history itself had quietly been rewritten. Margaret looked toward Clara with growing concern. If someone changed these records deliberately, she left the sentence unfinished. Clara completed it quietly. Then they never expected the originals to survive. In quote. Before either woman could continue, a sharp sound echoed outside. Hoofbeats, slow, deliberate. Both women extinguished the lamp immediately. Through the narrow front window, Clara watched a rider emerge from the darkness and stop beside the old Icehouse gate. The horse remained still, so did its rider. Hidden beneath a broad hat and heavy coat, the stranger simply studied the building without moving. Nearly a full minute passed before the horse turned slowly back toward town, disappearing into the darkness without a single word. Margaret released a nervous breath. Did you recognize him? Clara slowly shook her head. No. But deep inside, she was becoming increasingly certain that whoever searched for Elias Rowan's final will had realized they were no longer alone. Margaret remained at the Icehouse until well after nightfall, unwilling to leave Clara alone after the mysterious rider's visit. They spread every map across the broad work table once more, comparing faded survey lines beneath the gentle glow of a freshly lit lantern. The more carefully they studied the records, the more impossible the official story became. Every map created during Elias Rowan's lifetime identified Miller's Pond and the surrounding acreage as community property established through donations from dozens of Ash Creek families. Yet every document filed after his death quietly reassigned that same land to a handful of private investors whose names appeared repeatedly throughout the county archives. It had not happened by accident. Someone had patiently erased an entire chapter of the town's history, one legal document at a time. Margaret finally closed the last ledger and looked across the table at Clara. These papers should have changed everything years ago. Clara gently rested one hand upon Elias Rowan's journal. Perhaps they still can. Margaret hesitated before speaking again. There is one man who might remember more than anyone else. Who? Judge Holloway's former clerk, Samuel Brooks. He's nearly 80 now and lives alone outside Pine Ridge. If anyone saw the original probate records before they disappeared, it would have been him. Clara committed the name to memory. After Margaret departed, she locked every door and carefully climbed to the loft, where the walnut box remained hidden beneath loose floorboards. She checked each document once more before replacing everything exactly as she had found it. Her father often said that careful habits protected honest work better than sturdy locks ever could. As she settled beneath a wool blanket beside the small stove, sleep came only in short, restless moments. Before dawn, she awakened to an unfamiliar sound. Footsteps. Not inside the building. Outside. Slow, deliberate, circling the Icehouse. Clara quietly extinguished the lantern and remained perfectly still. Through a narrow gap between the loft boards, she watched pale morning light slowly brighten the enormous storage room below. Another sound followed. The faint scrape of leather against wood. Someone was testing the front door without forcing it. Whoever stood outside did not wish to leave obvious signs of entering. Minutes passed, then silence. Finally, after nearly half an hour, Clara cautiously descended the ladder. The front door remained locked exactly as she had left it, but fresh boot prints crossed the damp earth surrounding the building. She knelt beside one clear impression. The sole carried an unusual horseshoe-shaped iron pattern often found on expensive city-made riding boots rather than ordinary work footwear. Nearby, she discovered something else, a broken matchstick still carrying the faint smell of sulfur. Someone had stood beside the door long enough to strike a match and study the lock in darkness before deciding against entering. Clara slipped the match into her pocket. It was a tiny clue, yet clues often mattered because of the story they quietly joined together. Later that morning, she harnessed an old borrowed wagon and traveled toward Pine Ridge in search of Samuel Brooks. The journey took nearly 3 hours along narrow roads winding through forests painted with brilliant autumn colors. Samuel's small farmhouse stood alone beside a quiet stream where smoke drifted lazily from a stone chimney. The elderly man answered the door, leaning heavily upon a carved walking stick. His sharp gray eyes studied Clara carefully before softening at the mention of Elias Rowan's name. "I haven't heard anyone speak that name in 20 years," he said quietly, inviting her inside. His modest home overflowed with neatly stacked books, legal ledgers, and framed photographs faded by time. Clara explained everything except the exact location of the hidden chamber, choosing her words carefully, until she finally produced one folded copy of Elias Rowan's correspondence with Judge Holloway. Samuel adjusted his spectacles and read every line without interruption. When he finished, he slowly closed his eyes. "I knew these letters existed," he whispered, "but after the judge passed away, every copy disappeared." "Do you believe the will is genuine?" Clara asked. Samuel looked at her with complete certainty. "I watched Judge Holloway prepare the probate docket himself." He pointed toward Elias Rowan's signature. "That is unquestionably authentic." Clara felt hope quietly rising. Then why was nothing done? The old clerk sighed deeply. Because before the hearing could take place, the original filing packet vanished from the courthouse. Without it, the case simply ended. He walked slowly toward a tall cabinet and withdrew an aging leather folder tied with frayed string. "I kept one thing." Inside rested a single handwritten memorandum bearing Judge Holloway's personal seal. Across the bottom appeared one sentence: "Should the Rowan documents ever reappear, reopen probate immediately in the interest of justice." Samuel carefully placed the memorandum into Clara's hands. "This," he said softly, "may be enough to force the county court to hear the case at last." Clara thanked him with quiet gratitude before beginning the journey home. As evening settled over the countryside, she noticed another rider in the distance emerging onto the same road behind her wagon. The horse never approached too closely. It simply maintained its distance through mile after mile of quiet forest. Whenever Clara slowed, the rider slowed. Whenever she urged the wagon forward, the rider matched her pace. By the time Ash Creek appeared on the horizon, there could be little doubt. Someone was following her. She turned into the yard beside the abandoned icehouse, just as the last rays of sunlight slipped below the hills. The distant rider stopped at the crest overlooking Miller's Pond, remaining motionless long enough to watch her unload the wagon before quietly turning back toward town. Clara stood beside the old building until darkness settled completely around her. She no longer wondered whether the hidden will mattered. Someone else believed it mattered enough to watch her every movement. And that meant the quiet battle Elias Rowan had begun nearly 30 years earlier was no longer resting safely inside forgotten papers. Without ever intending to, Clara Whitmore had become the next guardian of a truth that powerful people still feared would finally come into the light. Clara returned to the Icehouse before dawn, determined that fear would not dictate the pace of her work. The old building had survived blizzards, floods, and nearly 30 years of neglect without surrendering, and she quietly resolved to do the same. She hid Judge Holloway's memorandum beneath the loose floorboards, alongside Elias Rowan's original will, then carefully replaced every board exactly as before. Looking around the enormous room, she realized the Icehouse had become far more than shelter. It had become a guardian of truth. Every weathered beam above her head now seemed to carry a responsibility shared across generations. She whispered softly, "You've protected these secrets long enough. Now it's my turn." As sunlight spread across Miller's Pond, Clara resumed replacing warped cedar siding as though nothing unusual had happened. By mid-morning, several townspeople wandered over simply to watch the remarkable transformation taking place. Children gathered near the doorway, while older farmers examined the freshly repaired walls with quiet admiration. One elderly woman smiled warmly. "I never thought I'd hear hammers echo from this place again." Clara returned the smile. Neither did the building. Gentle laughter followed, and for the first time since purchasing the Icehouse, the laughter no longer carried mockery. It carried hope. That small change did not escape Edwin Mercer. Standing across the road beside the general store, he watched the gathering crowd with growing concern. Every compliment directed toward Clara seemed to tighten his expression. The abandoned Icehouse had been expected to disappear quietly into history. Instead, it had become the center of conversation once again. By afternoon, Mercer crossed the road, accompanied by Alderman Victor Hale, a wealthy landowner whose family controlled much of the commercial property surrounding Ash Creek. Hale removed his expensive gloves slowly before stepping inside the building. His polished boots contrasted sharply with the weathered pine floor beneath them. He smiled politely, but the smile never reached his eyes. "Miss Whitmore," he began pleasantly, "you've certainly been busy." Clara set down her hammer. "Old buildings deserve attention." Hale nodded while casually studying every corner of the enormous room. His gaze lingered briefly upon the towering northern shelves before returning to Clara. "I've heard rumors you've been finding interesting things while cleaning." "Mostly dust," Hale chuckled. "Dust has a curious way of hiding valuable objects." Clara remained silent. Edwin Mercer stepped forward. "If you discover any old legal records, property documents, or financial papers belonging to the town, the bank would be happy to store them safely." "Why would the bank want them?" Clara asked calmly. Mercer answered without hesitation. "Historical preservation." Captain Owen Carlyle happened to arrive carrying fresh lumber at that exact moment. His appearance interrupted the conversation just long enough for Clara to notice Hale exchanging a brief glance with Mercer. It lasted only an instant, yet it spoke volumes. They had not come merely to admire her repairs. They had come searching for something. Hale tipped his hat politely before leaving. "If you require financial assistance restoring the property, Miss Whitmore, my office would gladly purchase it from you." Clara smiled gently. "Thank you, but I didn't buy it to sell it." Hale's smile disappeared almost imperceptibly. "Everyone sells eventually. Not everything." The two men departed without another word. Captain Carlyle watched them ride away before quietly placing the lumber beside the entrance. Those two never visit abandoned buildings unless they believe something valuable has been left inside. Clara looked toward the disappearing riders. "I was beginning to suspect the same." That evening, Margaret Ellsworth returned carrying another bundle of county archives. Together, she and Clara compared every newly discovered document with Elias Rowan's original records. The pattern became unmistakable. Nearly every altered survey map bore Victor Hale's signature as a county commissioner years before he inherited his family's fortune. Edwin Mercer's father had served as assistant registrar during the same period. Together, their names appeared repeatedly wherever property boundaries had quietly changed. "It wasn't one dishonest man," Margaret whispered. "It was an entire network." Clara slowly nodded. "Which means they have far more to lose than a single piece of land." Just then, hurried footsteps echoed outside. Walter Grayson burst through the doorway, breathing heavily from the steep climb. "You must listen carefully," he said between breaths. "Mercer has called a special council meeting tomorrow evening." Clara frowned. "For what purpose?" Walter handed her an official notice bearing the town seal. "Emergency Structural Safety Review. Ash Creek Icehouse." Margaret read the paper aloud. "Recommendation for immediate demolition due to public hazard." Silence settled across the room. Everyone understood what the notice truly meant. The building itself had suddenly become inconvenient. Captain Carlyle slowly folded his arms. "They intend to destroy the Icehouse." Walter nodded grimly. "If it's demolished tomorrow, anything hidden inside disappears forever." Clara looked around the enormous room. Warm evening sunlight streamed through the newly repaired windows, illuminating the very shelves behind which Elias Rowan had hidden the truth almost 30 years earlier. Suddenly, every hour she had spent restoring the building felt painfully fragile. A single council vote could erase everything before the will ever reached the courthouse. She walked slowly toward the northern wall, resting one hand against the weathered cedar shelves. Her father's voice echoed quietly through memory. "The harder skill is knowing what deserves another chance." She closed her eyes briefly before turning back toward her friends. "Then we won't let them tear it down." Captain Carlyle smiled. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say." Outside, the last light of day settled across Miller's Pond, casting long golden reflections against the weathered walls of the old icehouse. For nearly 3 decades, the building had silently protected the truth. Tomorrow, it would have to survive one final attempt to bury that truth forever. The following evening, the Ash Creek Town Hall filled earlier than anyone could remember. Farmers arrived, still wearing work boots, dusted with field soil. Shopkeepers closed their doors before sunset. Elderly residents who seldom ventured far from home quietly found seats along the back wall, whispering among themselves about the emergency meeting that had spread through town with unusual speed. Word that the old icehouse might be demolished had awakened memories many believed were gone forever. Clara entered carrying nothing more than a worn leather satchel. Inside rested Elias Rowan's will, the original deeds, Judge Holloway's memorandum, and every document she had carefully protected since discovering the hidden chamber. She did not intend to reveal them unless absolutely necessary. Truth, she had learned, achieved the greatest justice when revealed at exactly the right moment. Alderman Victor Hale stood confidently near the front of the room, speaking in low voices with Edwin Mercer and 2 county officials. Several neatly rolled engineering drawings rested upon the table before them, together with estimates for demolition costs. To anyone entering late, it appeared the decision had already been made. Walter Grayson quietly approached Clara before the meeting began. "They're expecting a quick vote," he whispered. "Hale believes no one will object." Clara looked around the crowded hall. More townspeople continued arriving every minute. Captain Owen Carlyle sat beside Margaret Ellsworth in the front row. Samuel Brooks, despite his advanced age, had traveled from Pine Ridge carrying his weathered leather folder beneath one arm. Their presence steadied her. She realized she was no longer standing alone. The town council president struck the wooden gavel sharply against the table. "This emergency session will come to order." Victor Hale rose almost immediately. His voice carried the practiced confidence of a man accustomed to agreement. "After recent inspection, the abandoned icehouse has been determined structurally unsafe and financially impractical to preserve. Continued maintenance would burden taxpayers unnecessarily. Therefore, I recommend immediate demolition before winter weather creates additional hazards." He unrolled one of the engineering sketches. Following removal, the property can be prepared for future commercial development, benefiting Ash Creek's economy. Several council members nodded politely. Hale continued, "The building has stood unused for years. It serves no practical purpose." Before the council president could call for discussion, Captain Owen Carlyle slowly rose from his seat. "With respect," he said calmly, "that building has served this town longer than any of us sitting here tonight." A few voices murmured agreement. Hale smiled courteously. "History deserves respect, Captain, but sentiment should not prevent progress." Margaret Ellsworth stood next. "History deserves honesty before progress," she answered. Hale's smile faded slightly. "Do you object to demolition?" "I object to forgetting why the building existed in the first place." The room grew noticeably quieter. Hale glanced toward Mercer before replying, "Unless someone possesses new evidence regarding the property, we should proceed." Clara quietly stood, every eye turned toward her. "I do possess new evidence." Silence settled over the hall. She walked slowly toward the front carrying the leather satchel. Without drama or accusation, she placed the aged walnut box upon the council table. Carefully she withdrew Elias Rowan's final will, Judge Holloway's memorandum, the original survey maps, and the supporting property deeds. Walter Grayson immediately recognized the probate seal. Samuel Brooks stepped forward. "I served as clerk to Judge Holloway," he announced clearly. "These documents are authentic." Victor Hale's confident posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Clara unfolded the will. Her voice remained steady as she read Elias Rowan's final declaration, leaving the Icehouse, Miller's Pond, and the surrounding land forever to the people of Ash Creek under community trust. Murmurs spread rapidly throughout the room. Farmers exchanged astonished glances. Elderly residents leaned forward to hear every word. When she finished reading, Samuel Brooks placed Judge Holloway's memorandum beside the will. The judge ordered this probate reopened should the missing documents ever be recovered. Margaret Ellsworth then displayed both the original and altered survey maps side by side. Someone deliberately changed these boundaries after Elias Rowan's death. Walter Grayson opened town record books, confirming that no lawful transfer of community ownership had ever been recorded before the alterations appeared. The evidence spoke more powerfully than any speech could have managed. Edwin Mercer rose abruptly. "These papers should be examined by proper authorities before anyone reaches conclusions." Samuel Brooks calmly answered, "Exactly, which is why they should have reached the courthouse nearly 30 years ago." The room fell completely silent. Victor Hale attempted one final defense. "Old paperwork cannot rewrite the present." Clara looked directly at him. "Truth doesn't rewrite history, it restores it." One elderly woman slowly stood near the back of the hall. "My grandfather helped raise that ice house." Another man rose. "Mine hauled the first ice harvest." Soon voices emerged throughout the crowded room. "My family donated timber. My father cut those beams. My mother cooked meals for the workers." The building no longer belonged to forgotten history. It belonged to living memory. The council president quietly reviewed the documents before laying down his spectacles. "Given the evidence presented tonight," he announced, "this council cannot lawfully authorize demolition." Relief swept across the room, but he continued, "Furthermore, these records shall be delivered immediately to the county court for formal probate review." Several weeks later, the county judge issued his decision. Elias Rowan's will was upheld in full. The altered property transfers were declared invalid. Ownership of the Icehouse, Miller's Pond, and the surrounding common land returned permanently to the community trust exactly as Elias Rowan had intended. No criminal charges followed. Too many responsible parties had long since passed away, yet Victor Hale quietly resigned from every remaining public office. Edwin Mercer left the bank before winter ended. His reputation diminished, not by public humiliation, but by the quiet loss of trust that money could never restore. Spring arrived with unusual excitement. For the first time in decades, families gathered once more beside Miller's Pond. Children laughed where silence had ruled for years. Volunteers repaired fences, rebuilt docks, painted the weathered icehouse, and restored its enormous doors together. Clara worked beside everyone else, never claiming special recognition, despite knowing none of it would have happened without her. When reporters from neighboring counties asked who deserved credit, Captain Owen Carlyle simply smiled. The building chose the right keeper. By autumn, the restored icehouse had become the heart of Ash Creek once again, not as a place storing winter ice, but as a community hall, historical museum, workshop, and gathering place where future generations could remember what ordinary people achieved whenever they built something together instead of apart. Above the restored entrance, a simple cedar plaque carried only one sentence from Elias Rowan's journal. "Honest people preserve what greedy people overlook." Every visitor paused to read it. Every child eventually asked what it meant. And every answer began with the story of a woman who lost everything, bought an abandoned icehouse everyone else mocked, and discovered behind forgotten shelves not merely one last will, but the forgotten heart of an entire town. When Clara first stood outside the abandoned ice house with only $7 hidden inside her weathered coat, nearly everyone in Ash Creek believed they understood what they were seeing. They saw a woman who had lost her home. They saw another forgotten building waiting patiently for collapse. They saw failure standing beside failure, imagining that together they could produce nothing except another sad ending. Yet time has always possessed a quiet habit of proving first impressions incomplete. The people of Ash Creek eventually discovered that the greatest value often hides beneath the very places the world dismisses too quickly. The old ice house had never merely stored blocks of winter ice. It had preserved something far more enduring. It had protected the memory of neighbors who believed communities belonged to everyone willing to build them together. It had quietly guarded justice until someone honest enough arrived to uncover it. Clara never became the richest woman in the county. She never sought public office, wealth, or recognition. Those had never been her ambitions. Instead, she became something far rarer. She became the faithful keeper of another person's promise. Every repaired beam, every restored shelf, every polished window inside the old ice house reminded future generations that ordinary acts of honesty often shape history more deeply than grand speeches ever can. Children who visited the restored building grew up hearing not only the story of Elias Rowan's hidden will, but also the story of the quiet woman who refused to abandon what everyone else had already declared worthless. Years later, travelers passing through Ash Creek frequently paused beside Miller's Pond to admire the beautifully restored ice house standing proudly against the changing seasons. Many assumed the building had survived simply because skilled craftsmen repaired old timber. The townspeople knew better. Buildings survive because someone chooses to remember why they mattered. Communities survive because ordinary people decide that truth deserves protecting, even when protecting it requires sacrifice. Whenever visitors asked how such an extraordinary story could possibly be true, Captain Owen Carlyle always answered with the same gentle smile. "Every town has forgotten treasures," he would say. "Most are simply waiting for the right hands to uncover them." Clara often smiled whenever she overheard those words, though she rarely added anything herself. She preferred letting the old building speak. It had waited patiently for nearly 30 years to tell its story. Now, every child laughing inside its walls, every family gathering beneath its restored roof, and every neighbor sharing meals within the great hall continued that story without even realizing it. The abandoned ice house no longer stood as a reminder of loss. It stood as living proof that what the world overlooks is not always empty. Sometimes it is quietly carrying the future of an entire community, waiting for one honest soul willing to look behind the shelves where everyone else chose not to search. And whenever the first snow of winter settled gently across Miller's Pond, Clara Whitmore would pause outside the old ice house before unlocking its great wooden doors, remembering the frightened woman who had once arrived there believing she had lost everything. Looking back, she understood at last what her father had tried to teach her so many years before. The harder skill had never been repairing old buildings. The harder skill had always been recognizing what still deserved another chance. In saving the forgotten ice house, Clara had unknowingly saved part of herself, and in doing so, she had given an entire town permission to remember who they had always been. Thank you for spending this time with us and for sharing in Clara Whitmore's remarkable journey. Stories like hers remind us that the greatest treasures in life are rarely the ones people expect to find. More often, they are hidden inside forgotten places, quiet acts of kindness, and ordinary people who refuse to give up when the world has already decided their story is over. If this tale touched your heart, we hope you'll share it with someone who could use a reminder that hope is often waiting where others have stopped looking. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time in your own life when you discovered unexpected value in something or someone that everyone else had written off? Your story may encourage someone reading it today. If you enjoy original emotional Western stories filled with mystery, resilience, forgotten places, and quiet acts of courage, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more journeys across the American frontier. Until next time, Stay close, keep believing that overlooked things still matter, and never underestimate what one honest heart can restore.